Zoom link. For those of you, and there are a few that do not know me, I'm Dr. Mariana Orlandi, Executive Director of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. The Austin Institute is an independent organization that focuses on the topics of marriage, family, and human sexuality. Our work largely involves formation and mentorship of graduate and undergraduate students with students fellowship, reading groups, and seminars. And we are very, very thankful for this standing collaboration with the Salem Center for Policy at UT that allows us to be also present on campus. With the Salem Center, we have already hosted a series of stellar speakers, such as Aaron Cariati and Carl Truman. And next month, on January 16th, even though it's not yet on the website, we'll be having with us a professor of architecture in Notre Dame, who's an expert on urbanism and human flourishing, Professor Philip Best. Today, however, since this is the reason why you came here, we are approaching a much more philosophical and political theme. We will be hearing about modernity and the way it may have paved the way to totalitarianism. By doing so, modernity, or its prominent version, the one that we're all familiar with, may indeed have affected with devastating effects precisely that reality that our work, the work of the Austin Institute, puts at the center, the family. Somehow prophetically, Augusto del Noce, an Italian philosopher who lived in the past century, saw all these things coming. And in fact, he also foresaw the confusion around human sexuality and described what he called the ascendance of eroticism. And I'd say that he predicted most of the reality in which we're living, with fluid and unstable relationships, the ones that, again, our institute and the work of our faculty fellows continue to address in their research and in their writings. So for this same reason, two of our reading groups this past year have focused on the crisis of modernity, one of the volumes by the mention. So as a fellow Italian, I'm also honored twice today. Not only because we will be discussing the thought of an Italian genius, but also because our speaker, Professor Carlo Lancelotti, was born in Italy too, and probably a sort of a genius too. He is a professor of mathematics at the College of Staten Island, and on the faculty of physics programs at City University, New York Graduate Center. While his primary scholarly work has been in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics and kinetic theory, and I said it right, Professor Lancelotti is also the man who made it possible for English speakers to get acquainted with Del Noce's work. He has translated in this past year most of his work and published 3 of his volumes: The Age of Secularization, The Problem of Atheism, and The Crisis of Modernity. And besides translating, Professor Lancelotti has written numerous essays of his own on Del Noce and on other subjects, which have appeared in Communio, Public Discourse, the Churchlight Journal, and many more. And for those who follow us already, he was also an incredible guest on our podcast, What We Can't Not Talk About. But today we have a live version of that. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Lancelotti.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Is this working? Yes. All right. So, Del Noce was a very prolific writer. He talked about many topics. But I'm happy that Mariana asked me to talk about totalitarianism. This is what I think is my task. Because totalitarianism was really one of the main reasons why I decided to do some translations of Del Noce. I've been in this country for 30 years, and I often had this impression that there are some totalitarian strains in American politics and in American culture, and that some of the reasons they expand is because the historical experience of the United States has been very different from the European historical experience. I mean, as you know, the European historical experience in the 20th century was heavily marked by totalitarian movements, like fascism, Nazis, communists. We had a whole bunch of those. And this, to some degree, has maybe made people cynical, but also less exposed to some of the most obvious totalitarian temptations. And so, as a European in the United States, on a few occasions, it struck me that in the public debate, people were not familiar with some of the features of totalitarian movements. And so, in this sense, the Noce could be a useful contribution because the Noce was always very concerned with totalitarianism because he lived it on his own skin as a young man. He was born in 1910, and of course, he grew up in fascist Italy. And most importantly, in the 30s, then he faced the tragedies of the war, of Nazis. And after the war, communism became very powerful in Italy and many other European countries. And so the question of totalitarianism for the Noce was not just an abstract philosophical question, but was very much a lived, open wound, if you want to so say. And especially, I thought that the Noce's contribution is important because even among educated people, among, let's say, the intellectuals, often totalitarianism has been misunderstood. I mean, if you look backwards to the 50s and 60s, in the immediate wake of the great totalitarian tragedies in Europe, you could see that many interpretations kind of fell short. By this I mean that typically totalitarianism was not recognized as an original modern phenomenon. Okay? There was many interpretations that do totalitarianism as a throwback, say, to the Middle Ages, right? Like an explosion of intolerance, like a moral failure. Or on the other hand, could just be the traditional form of tyranny, but supported by modern technologies. I think that could be an explanation that Hitler was not different from Genghis Khan, just tanks or something like that. Other explanations are psychological. You might have heard of, there was Fromm's book on the authoritarian personality. There was Wilhelm Reich, the psychoanalytical interpretation of fascism as repression, right? That people were repressed and so they became fascist. And if we get them to be sexually liberated, they will all be liberal. And there was all kind of psychological, sociological interpretations. Or there was simply the idea that in some sense, the totalitarianism was a failure, it was a rebellion against the Enlightenment, against modern tolerance and freedom. And so in a sense, what we had to do to defeat fascism was to go back to the Enlightenment, right? Without realizing that if you look historically, there is a lot of thinkers broadly associated with Enlightenment, like, I don't know, Rousseau, or Condorcet, or the ideologues, or even de Sade, that in some sense have totalitarian strengths. Okay? So it seems risky to think that we have to go back to the Enlightenment to defeat totalitarianism, unless you understand exactly if totalitarianism itself does not express some strains that are intrinsically modern and even associated with Enlightenment itself. So these were the Noce's concerns. And the Noce's approach was what I would call strictly philosophical. The Noce maintained that many times in history, ideas do matter, and that political phenomena reflect worldviews, which are intrinsically philosophical. They may not be expressed always in form of technical philosophical works, but they are philosophical or religious, right? And so I thought that the totalitarianism itself cannot be understood without understanding the larger philosophical trajectory of the modern world. Now, in order to introduce his views on the matter, I think I will start by doing a little bit of phenomenological description. The Noce provides several definitions of totalitarianism, right? I had a friend who was collecting them from different books and kind of making fun of the fact that he has 5 or 6. But the truth is that when you have a complex phenomenon, you can look at it from different angles and you get different definitions, but these definitions are all connected. They're all related. You can start from one and deduce the others, right? So the first definition that the Noce offers of totalitarianism is the idea of the use of the words absolutization of politics. Absolutization of politics means that politics invades every aspect of life and every aspect of society. And I want to start from this one because I think you can recognize it in contemporary American life. I don't know, I was reading a while ago, there was this controversy among musicologists, and they had this big fight because somebody wanted to decolonize musicology. Mm-hmm. And now the word decolonization is one common term that you hear, and somebody else, there was this classicist at Princeton, right? And he was a scholar of Latin and Greek, and he also decided that that the problem of Latin and Greek scholarship is I don't know, maybe you call it white supremacy or some other political term, right? So you see that aspects of life like musicology or Greek and Latin, you would not think they should be highly political, but politics inserts itself in every aspect. Or like, if you look at many churches, they're split politically. And again, why would politics determine how people organize themselves within the same religious faith? And yet they do. Every time there is some big event in society, the death of George Floyd or Gaza, everybody is expected to take a political position. The beekeepers of America are expected to have a position on, George Floyd or something like that. So this is what I mean by the fact that a sign of a generally, in a very broad sense, totalitarian mindset is when politics makes a claim on every aspect of life. Of course, you can see that in extreme form if you go to Soviet Russia, right? But we are not there, obviously. But when every professional association divides along political issues that are not related to the matter of the association, to the discipline of the association, that's an interesting phenomenon. I don't know, another example I read that there was Scientific American. There was this cover story in Scientific American on the fact that there is that men and women are not biological concepts. Now, most biologists would be perplexed by that, and still, Scientific American used to be an American institution that reflected a non-political interest. What could be less political than, physics or chemistry, and still politics intervenes. Okay, you can do it in art. And you can argue that Hollywood is not doing very well because, again, even the artists understand themselves as political actors. Okay, so this is the first example of what Del Noce calls the absolutization of politics. Now, that's one. That's one corner. Okay, this is like the phenomenological, sociological perspective. But then there is a perspective which should be defined, the theoretical or philosophical perspective. From this perspective, Del Noce describes the totalitarianism as the denial of the universality of reason. This is another formula that he talks about. And this formula, the denial of the universality of reason, means that when you have a totalitarian phenomenon, even knowledge, even rationality becomes political. So, to give you an example from the past, think of the communism. In communism, the idea was that there is not an objective universal philosophy. There is bourgeois philosophy and there is proletarian philosophy. Or think of Nazism, like art. There is no universal art. There is Aryan art and there is Jewish or degenerate art, right? I can give you examples with fascism. You can find many examples, right? In every totalitarian movement, reason itself, rationality, the spiritual life in general, art, becomes politicized, so there is no more universality. You and I, if I am a bourgeois and you're a proletarian, we are both determined by material factors. My way of thinking is the bourgeois way of thinking, you have the proletarian way of thinking. We cannot talk. There is no universal ground for debate or persuasion, right? For the simple fact that all of rationality is determined by certain belongings, right? Today, it's much more race-oriented, right? People are determined by, I don't know, some somatic features, all right? But again, their rationality, their way of thinking is the thinking of their group, right? Because it is the thinking of their group is not universal, right? And so another characteristic phenomenon of totalitarian movements, if you look historically, that they always deny that there is a universal logos, to use the Platonic Greek word. In this sense, totalitarian movements tend to replace philosophy with ideology. Now, the word ideology is another word that should be discussed at length, because often and again, in this case, I think that in the US, people have less exposure to the phenomenon. People describe ideology in a very generic sense as a worldview, right? They think ideology is a way of thinking. But the word has also a more specific meaning. The specific meaning of the word ideology is that you have a form of discourse which is entirely designed for political gain, right? An ideology is something, while philosophy, at least in its more noble interpretation, should be the search for the truth. An ideology is a tool, is ideas as tools, right? I think that the Noce got this idea from Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, of all people, is the one which is probably closer to the Noce. Hannah Arendt, in The Origin of Totalitarianism, describes how ideology is this logical development for a prejudice for the sake of political domination, right? So if you want to dominate a society, you need a discourse. You have the discourse of race, the discourse of class, the discourse of gender, okay, you name it. But you need some discourse which is not designed to achieve a universal truth, but to liberate and gain power for a certain political project, right? So this kind of discourse at the service of a political project, in the Noce view, and I think it's reasonable, is the appropriate definition of what an ideology is, right? So it's not a generic worldview. It is an instrumental worldview. It's a worldview that pretends to tell a story, but this story is developed abstractly, in a completely abstract way, by certain prejudice. I don't know, everything is about class struggle, or everything is about sexual liberation, or everything is about the oppression of, like Fanon, the oppression of certain races by other races. Okay, so you start from this assumption, and then you apply it universally in an instrumental way. Does that make sense? I mean, this is what ideology means. So you see that basically totalitarianism, in this sense, has these characteristics of replacing philosophy. Of replacing philosophy with ideology. Probably airplane mode is a good idea. Yeah, I'm giving a talk. Sorry, can you do that? Channel. Yes. There we go. Where was it? Yeah, okay, so that's the second thing. You can describe totalitarianism in terms of ideology. The third description of totalitarianism that the Noce provides is ethical. What is the ethics of a totalitarian movement? In this regard, the Noce has the proposal of what he calls the ethics of the direction of history. Okay? The ethics of direction of history is the assumption that in every ideology, history is marching towards something, right? Toward the dictature of the proletariat, or towards the 1,000 Reich of the German people, or towards sexual happiness, as Wilhelm Reich calls it, or towards dismantling the supremacy of this group or that group, right? Okay, every totalitarianism, every political movement with totalitarian ambitions is thinks that history is marching inevitably in some direction, right? And this determines ethics, because ethics is that if you stand in the way of the direction of history, you're bad. If you assist, if you aid the direction of history, you're good, right? Antonio Gramsci says that word by word. If you support everything that sustains the revolution is good, everything that opposes the revolution is bad, right? So this communism is a very classic example of this ethics of the direction of history. Okay, so another way you say it today is that you have to be on the right side of history. Then let's see, this is my list of characteristics. Ethics, theory, phenomenology. There is also then a more subtle, but probably deeper understanding of totalitarianism, which is religious. Okay? And I think that for the Noce, this is the crucial understanding, because at the end of the day, the Noce thinks that what motivates the totalitarian is a set of religious assumptions. And the Noce, in his book called The Problem of Atheism, which, by the way, should not be the first book you read because it's very dense. If you want to read the book, starts with the other ones. The Crisis of Modernity is my recommendation for the exposure to the Noce. But in this book called The Problem of Atheism, the Noce does a taxonomy of forms of atheism. And he says that you can distinguish different kinds of atheists. There is a scientific atheist in the 19th century. People just believe that we are what we eat, like those German biologists of the age. There is what he calls a negative or desperate pessimistic atheist, like Schopenhauer or Leopardi in Italy. People for whom the absence of God is a tragedy, ultimately, it's a God. But then the Noce says that there is a third type of atheist, which is called positive atheist. And a positive atheist is an atheist who, in some sense, has to not repudiate God, but repudiate original sin. Right? Because the problem of an atheist is that the human life is miserable and there is death and suffering. So, okay, there is no God. Now we are stuck, right? I mean, that's the predicament of the atheist. So the positive atheist affirms that heaven is possible on earth, right? The positive atheist is a believer that ultimately there is problems that are making us miserable, but we can remove them. Right? We have the power to appropriate what we projected onto God, this image of happiness, of power, of beauty that we project onto God, we can appropriate. So it is possible to achieve human fulfillment in history. Right? To explain for the Noce, the prototype of the positive atheist was Marx. Marx was the first really positive atheist in his view. But you see that then for the positive atheist, you must believe in the direction of history. And so did Marx, right? Because history, there must be a theory of history whereby we're going to achieve heaven and earth. If we are just going to play around forever, making one step forward, two steps backwards, that doesn't cut it, right? There must be a mechanism in history. The progress of it doesn't need to be the Marxist mechanism, could be the technocratic American mechanism of the 60s. Forever technological expansion, right? Or sexual liberation. There can be different methods, but the positive atheist must believe that there is a road, to heaven on earth. And then this is where the totalitarian aspect already comes in, because if somebody stands in the way, he has to be crushed, right? You see what I mean? I mean, if somebody stands in the way of the march of humanity towards happiness in history, not heaven up there, but in history, then he must be crushed, or she. Because it is simply unacceptable. Too much is at stake. I mean, and you can see this sometimes in the political fanaticism of certain characters. You can see these days, right? For them, politics is everything. Because if you take away the hope for politics, there is no hope. Right? I mean, if you take away that kind of political hope, there is no other hope, right? So this is, let's say, the religious aspect of totalitarianism, which is not atheism in general, because atheism can mean different things, but specifically positive atheism. This kind of positive political atheism for the Noce is really probably the most radical definition of totalitarianism, so much so that in some work, I forget where he says that really totalitarianism is political atheism. Right? But we don't want to get people offended. Okay, it's not that everybody who doesn't believe in God is totalitarian, right? But it means that totalitarianism is political atheism in the sense of Marx, in the sense of positive atheism. Since I'm talking about Marx, I will make also a comment about that. Of course, the Noce regards Marx primarily as a philosopher. I say this because, today there is the whole conversation about cultural Marxism. In some sense, Marxism is dead. I mean, the Noce would agree that nobody today thinks that we are going to have communism in the Leninist sense, or that we are going to have the proletariat taking over. That kind of economical, political Marxism is probably not coming back, right? So when the Noce talks about Marx, he thinks that that Marx is significant today, not so much as an economic or political thinker, but strictly as a philosopher. Okay? So the young Marx, the Marx of the thesis of Feuerbach, to him is the still relevant Marx, not as a politician, not as an economist, but as the kind of the first, the prototype of the positive atheist, the atheist who believes in the direction of history, okay, who believes in the possibility of heaven on earth. So, how am I doing with that? So those are generally speaking the Noce's description of what totalitarianism is about. Now, you can see from this that, first of all, totalitarianism is a very modern phenomenon. right? Far from going back to some kind of pre-modern, medieval, Genghis Khan kind of excess. Totalitarianism is only possible in a post-Christian culture. Why? Because in a pre-Christian culture, essentially, there was not a clear distinction between man and the cosmos, right? Man was part of the cosmos, right? And so, in a sense, if you take a Greek or a Roman, they don't feel deeply the problem of the fulfillment of the individual. In some sense, you need a Saint Augustine, right? You need some sense in which man transcends nature. And you need technology, right? The idea that man can impose himself on nature and master nature and put nature at the service of its own fulfillment is a necessary premise for totalitarianism. Right? So that's why I said that it is an intrinsically post-Christian phenomenon. You could not get totalitarians before Christianity. At the same time, you need to leave behind Christianity in these positive ethics, right? So the Noce would disagree with people who don't recognize how modern totalitarianism is. Let me see if I cover all my points here. Yeah. Okay. Now, I said that Marx is the prototype for the Noce of the modern positive atheist, and that his philosophy is still influential, but is really the form of totalitarianism that we're facing today a Marxist kind of totalitarianism? No, not in the specific sense. It can be in the generic sense in which Marx introduced these philosophical ideas, but the Noce thinks that after World War II, there was the rise of a new type of potential totalitarianism, which, now don't be scandalized, calls the West. Right? I mean, this is kind of scandalous for us because we are used to think of the West in the Cold War framework, right? In the Cold War framework, the West is opposed to the East, right? It's opposed to the Soviet Union, right? So the West stands for freedom and so on, which is okay. But in the Noce's opinion, in order to understand today's totalitarianism, we have to understand how people responded to the old totalitarianism, right? Because when fascism and Nazism was defeated, the big problem was to face communism. And communism, in a sense, was a very materialistic ideology. So the Noce in the 50s and 60s believed that in the first 10 years of World War II, people had this idea that you could oppose communism on the ground of Christianity, for example, that communism was atheistic and we could face it based on Christianity. But then he noticed that starting around the late 50s, early 60s, there was a switch in Western culture. And the idea became prevalent that we can defeat communism on the ground of greater secularity. That's what he said. We can defeat communism by being more materialistic, by in a sense providing well-being, okay? Because it's the society of well-being, right? The society of comfort, of affluence, Galbraith called it the affluent society, right? That it is possible to defeat the totalitarian ideologies with a Western ideology, the ideology of continued material expansion and sexual liberation, right? And so to him, really, the sexual revolution itself was part of this response to communism, or this response to totalitarianism, by trying to offer a different utopia, okay? In a sense, the utopia of sexual happiness, of universal bourgeois well-being, if you want to use that word. So, in his opinion, this response has totalitarian potential. Okay? For most people, maybe it will not be totalitarian, but it does have totalitarian potential because, again, it believes in the possibility of a completely secular happiness and determines a sort of direction of history. Okay? The direction of history was greater and greater affluence, greater and greater secular liberation. We always find one more category of people to liberate. Right? Never end, right? You always have a new group of people that are repressed, and they must be liberated. Okay? So to him, this and so you see that in a sense, the ideology of the West after World War II for the Noce combines elements of liberalism and Marxism. Okay? The element of Marxism that we have kind of preserved is a sort of materialism, a certain sense of the preeminence of the economic dimension, right? The preeminence of the economic dimension has become a very established assumption in our culture, but at the same time has been combined with a sort of individualism, right? That it's no longer collectivist like old communism, but it is a belief that the individual can liberate himself or herself individually. So this combination of some sort of all liberal individualistic bourgeois ideas with certain Marxist materialistic economicistic prejudice for the Noce defines the Western world as it took shape in around the 1960s, right? And from them on. And so I think that he's dead. He died in 1989, but I think he would argue that if you extrapolate these tendencies that were established there, you would get some totalitarian expressions like we can see today. So for him, the modern West, the modern secularized West is a different form of positive atheism, which combines liberal and Marxist elements in a new kind of mush, in kind of a suit, right? And so that's the understanding I get from his works. Yeah, so a typical, if you look around in our culture, you can see both of those elements. For instance, there is a typical Marxist element in extreme political activism, right? I mean, the idea that you can give meaning to your life by being active, by changing stuff, right? Except that this is a Marxist element separated from the theory of history. Marx also had a theory of history, that history was going to have certain mechanisms that would bring about the revolution. After the revolution, the dictatorship with the proletariat, and so on and so forth. That's all gone, right? So when you have this kind of activism separated from any theory of history, you get some kind of headless activist, right? Just to be an activist for the sake of being an activist without ever doing anything, right? Think of all the political movements in the last 20 years, Occupy Wall Street, Me Too, this and that. They are all active, they all have something to complain about, but did you see any lasting political building coming out of them? It's very difficult to build anything if you just have an active rebellion, a desire to complain about the existing reality, but you don't have some positive role. So that's why, in a sense, our totalitarianism is so messy, right? Because we don't have a strong rationality anymore. So we have these impulses that lead to totalitarianism, but we don't have much. We don't have, the das Kapital or anything else to structure. The good thing that the Noce says is that precisely because totalitarian movements do not rely on some universal truth, but they just rely on an ideology, they are entirely determined by their outcome, right? Because if you bet all your money on the direction of history, and then after 30 years, history doesn't follow, your movement will tank. I mean, basically, the typical things you see in this kind of totalitarian movements is that after a while, they run out of steam because the history does not obey their expectation. So, at this point, the question that always gets raised, that of course neither I nor the Noce have a good answer to, is what is one to do? One thing that I always like to say, and maybe I will use it as a conclusion, is that time to conclude too early?
We have more time for questions. So I don't want more
time. I don't want to bore you. The point is this, that because totalitarianism is this absolutization of politics, it is kind of foolish to think we can defeat it on just political ground. Because politics is the world sphere of totalitarianism. So the negation of totalitarianism, in a sense, is to say there are things that are more important than politics, right? There are things that are bigger and deeper and more interesting than politics. Okay? I mean, that takes a lot of discipline, because when the totalitarian is harassing you, you just like to harass him back in some sense. I mean, and in some situations that's necessary or justified. But at the end of the day, if totalitarianism has this kind of religious root, right? If totalitarianism is rooted in this kind of positive atheism, or whatever you want to call it, it cannot be just defeated politically. On one hand, as I said, it will run out of steam when the direction of history doesn't get fulfilled. But for the time being, in some sense, one has to deny the supremacy of the political. And the only way to deny the supremacy of the political is to appeal to the fact that people desire more. right? Because you see, another way of expressing the totalitarian emphasis on ideology is that it is totally abstract. It totally ignores people's real desires, real problems. It's abstract. Abstract means that you start with some assumption, again, classic assumptions. All of history is about class strife. And then you abstractly develop, right? And you try to fit everything in the box. You know, like in today is comical. Everything is decolonization. Okay, let's try to cram everything into the decolonization box. At the end of the day, this is totally ignoring people's real needs and desires, right? People do have desire for beauty, for universal truth, you know, and these are the things that totalitarianism has to deny. People have philosophical questions. They are not happy with ideology. So except for people who are really, really suffering from some serious spiritual malaise, most people will be responsive to an appeal to this desire, right? The desire for truth or the desire for beauty. So in a sense, that's why I think that Noce will say that totalitarianism has to be challenged at this level, at the level of replacing the ideological abstractions with an appeal to genuine human experience. I mean, when I talk about abstraction, it always reminds me of the great American writer Walker Pierce, right? Says that we are the most abstract people who ever lived. I think that's what it means, right? It means that we live by these ideological schemes that have kind of detached ourselves from our fundamental humanity. So ultimately, the recovery of this humanity is probably the crucial factor. All right, that's it.
We're not talking about the reality in which we live, which sounds to be totalitarian, but it's a fraction of time. Mainly because I think that a few of us will have questions, and so there can be more time. We have until 1:30 more or less to ask questions. So anybody wants to go first?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I was writing as fast as I could. Every point was just so well stated and helped me understand even more. So thank you. My question is, I recently saw a lawyer from Austria just speaking on how the gender identity change being placed into law, that any law that's not based in objective reality, an observable objective reality like the sexed, embodiedness of male and female, requires a totalitarian approach. It requires coercion. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit on some of the things that obviously are coming out of this mindset that are actually being put into law, that have the force of law, with respect to where the observable reality of objective material reality is even replaced by ideologies, like you mentioned the Scientific American issue. So I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit with the legal implications and just how societally to respond to that when things like these totalitarian aspirations actually get ensconced in law.
Well, let's put it this way. When you get to that point, it's usually too late. Let me backtrack a little bit. One aspect of ideology is that ideology, in order to impose itself, has to typically make appeal to some science, to some pseudoscience, right? I mean, and this is another characteristic of totalitarian movements that I didn't mention, but you can easily find it in history, right? Scientific socialism in the Soviet Union, or under Nazi Germany, it was a kind of eugenics. In the 50s and 60s, everybody went crazy with sexology, psychology, psychoanalysis. Okay, all these things, all these ideologies always made appeal to some kind of scientism. Right? Again, distinctions are necessary because there is more than one type of scientism, but it is one type of scientism which is strictly at the service of ideology, and it is the way opposition is dismissed. Right? Opposition is dismissed by stating that you are not scientific. Now we have the science of whatever, right? Now, This is getting weaker because if you're talking about the latest controversies on gender stuff, the science there seems to be horribly weak. even there is not much to hang your hat on. But the point, though, is that once you get to the stage where you have a scientific culture, a culture without philosophy, then it's very hard to redirect this kind of debates, right? I mean, I always remember Pope Benedict XVI making the claim that we need a broadening of reason. I mean, the broadening of reason was precisely, in a sense, the recovery of reason rooted in experience, right? Because it's a reason capable of exploring all dimensions of reality and to come to conclusions based on shared experiences, not subjectivist experiences, but shared, possibly shared experiences that, in a sense, force themselves on ideology. The Noce also makes the distinction between authority and power. That's another point I didn't cover, but the point of authority, he says, again, quoting the Greeks and Hannah Arendt, is that authority imposes itself on you because of its evidence, while power has to impose itself using ideology, using a logical deduction from some arbitrary assumption that is not rooted in experience, right? So once authority has totally been removed from society, there is only power. When there is only power, well, you can try to have more power than the other guy. I'm not good at that. Some people are good, but I wish you luck, right? You know, in some sense, it is a fundamental problem when reason has been so narrowed and authority has been, what's the word, annulled, then all there is power. And this is the way a lot of these movements operate today. They will argue that there is only power, and so some people need a bigger share of power than others. Okay, I don't know if I answered your question, but my point is that when you get to that stage, well, it could be time to go to the mountains. You know, I mean, it's very late.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I have a question that kind of relates to that one about what Del Noce thinks about education. I and some of my coworkers here, we're in K-12 education, and it feels like in some ways we're always living in Plato's shadow. Like Plato talked about, like the education of the children being important because you can't take adults out of their frameworks in some way that have been informed by one kind of philosophy or another. And does Del Noce say, does he have writings about how to kind of teach this way of life that is one that has this kind of capacity for beauty, for art, for truth in a way that the totalitarian has like convinced themselves doesn't exist? That what does Del Noce think about like how highly does he prioritize education in the kind of when it is too late in this way of like when the kind of political society is gone astray? How can it?
To be honest, it doesn't, because of his own style and interest, he's more interested into politics and political philosophy than education. So if you go to his books, you will not find much on that. I can extrapolate my impression. My personal impression is that I think that also education is downstream from what could be a fundamental dichotomy between what he calls the Platonist and the instrumentalist view of the world, right? In what he calls in a more Platonist perspective, ideas have a reality, and there is a universal shared rationality, and so there is a civilization. So a civilization is the introduction of, when you educate, you introduce the young to this kind of wisdom about eternal things, if you want to put it that way. So in that sense, more than the Noce, I would recommend Simone Weil, for example. Simone Weil talks about that a lot, right? The Noce is more on the critical side. It says that at the other side of this kind of Platonism in a broad sense, there is instrumentalism, the idea that ideas are just tools, right? That ideas are instruments. And I see this is very common in our educational system, is the idea that you don't learn to know, you learn to do, right? You learn how to. I mean, I don't know, I sit in my my children's school sometimes, that there is no idea that there is a value in making the child aware of reality in the broadest possible sense. The value is that to make the child successful. The idea of success is kind of toxic if you think about it. It is the idea that you have to learn how to navigate the system, right? You have to learn how to do things to achieve certain limited goals arbitrarily established by society for you. And so I think that's what the Noce calls that would be what he calls the instrumentalist approach to education. And that's what he thinks has to be taught. But I think he mostly makes a negative comment. Yes.
I'm curious about this idea that, Del Noce, that you mentioned, that because totalitarian movements are based on ideology, they're determined by outcomes. And so it sort of proves that the direction of history was other than thought, so the game is up. I don't know. It seems optimistic to me. I think we've, the data's in on the sexual revolution, and it has not been a smashing success. And there's the evidence of it is anywhere you look in our culture, but there seems to be a willful blindness to
people can cling to their delusions for a long time.
And that's what I wonder is what kind of outcomes. Like, how bad does it have to get for people to?
If you read these people like Reich and Marcuse from the 60s, their idea would be that they would get perfectly psychophysical well-being for everybody. Now, if you look around, I think most people realize that the psychophysical well-being is not really going that strong. So I think that there is hope that reality, for better or for worse, will impose it. The Noce was Catholic, of course, and he said that the real problem is not so much that people insist on these things, but that Catholics go along. Right? I mean, there's some strong things about Catholics are a mentally inferior species. No offense, but he was referring to the idea that the world has changed for good. That what used to be moral is now immoral, and vice versa. And when these things happen, they're irreversible. And there is no permanent human nature. There is no permanent human desires that ultimately just sell themselves. That's a temptation, but I think it's a temptation that should be rejected. Because at the end of the day, we know that people desire real love. We know that people are disgusted by being turned into meat, so to speak. You can make a list of things that are there objectively in the human heart. So that's what one has to bet the farm on, if you wish, on the permanence of the connection between the human heart and the transcendent. If that's not the case, we can go home. Yes.
So I was wondering, because you mentioned the enlightenment, and that maybe it comes from it. So to what extent do you think, or to much I think that totalitarianism actually comes from it, and maybe the fact that kind of like the Enlightenment tried to cut off the rest of history, like they tried to separate themselves from
to start
previous
a new brain,
thought. And so, because I'm doing some research and I'm trying to go through this, and I'm wondering whether there's a connection between the church schism, this enlightenment, maybe Protestantism and enlightenment, and these things.
Well, the enlightenment was complicated. There are different lines. There is the enlightenment of Diderot and company that is very anti-clerical. There is the enlightenment of Montesquieu, who is more liberal. There is even some kind of Christian enlightenment. So there are different terms. But the Noce typically thinks that the first appearance of the idea of revolution, and so implicitly of the idea of a direction of history, is in Rousseau. Now, the question is Rousseau really Enlightenment? Not really. Rousseau was half Enlightenment and half against Enlightenment. He was a very ambiguous kind of guy. So I think that the Noce was inclined to say that clarity on these things emerged with the post-Enlightenment generation, like Marx. Because if you, for example, if you take in the history of European philosophy, take Hegel, Hegel is a romantic, he's a response to the Enlightenment, but he's also somehow believes in freedom. You know, when a young man, Hegel went and planted the tree of freedom in his town and then got all excited by Napoleon. I mean, Hegel in some sense was, but in the deeper sense, he thinks that Hegel was the last philosopher who still believed in universal rationality. But there is a universal spirit, that there is this cosmic universal spirit that embraces everybody. To get this total reduction of reason to doing, to instrumentality, in which you really thinks that we make ourselves, through our work, through the means of production, that humanity makes itself. He thinks that really Marx was a turning point. That's his inclination. So he sees Marx as a pivotal thinker, maybe because he's dealing with communism, but his argument is philosophical. So I mean, that's his inclination. Later in life, he discovered the Sad. The Sad is interesting because the Noce thought that one big contributor to the sexual revolution was surrealism, right? And surrealism was an artistic movement around the 30s and 40s, and it was somehow sadist in some sense. And so there is a strain of the Enlightenment that for him is potentially pre-totalitarian in some sense. And that was also the theory of, Adorno and Horkheimer. The dialectics of enlightenment is a book by Adorno and Horkheimer, in which they talk about Sad, trying to explain Nazism. Okay? But anyway, one has to be careful. So I don't have a completely satisfactory answer. I would say that one has to really ask oneself where this sequence of ideas got established. And
I noticed that there's the church breakup seems to have extended to like a cultural, like a actual breakup between Northern and Southern Europe to a point that
now or in the past?
Even now, like to a point that I've seen research basically that just ignores, like the northern part of Europe is kind of like the successful part and typically ignores the southern contribution from the southern side. And it's very intriguing. And
how do you relate that to the previous point?
So I relate it to kind of like the break of the church, this, but also to this Enlightenment idea that kind of like push forward the British experience and the French and the German, and put down Spain, Italy. So I don't fully know what I'm looking at, but I know that it's interesting.
Yes.
I mean, to continue on this part of the French Revolution, some of the, they call them conservatives, we can call them anti-totalitarians, I would say, students. They're very curious about the French Revolution. And just last night, I was, telling them some of the bad things about it. But I think that something very interesting that if you could say more about these aspects that I found in the notes is that, as you just said, it doesn't paint it all black and all white.
Right.
And there is something that I really like of how he appreciates in liberalism the centrality of human freedom, which I think is related to his friendship with Maritain too, or not friendship, but similarities. And I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, that's a difficult question because we faced in what the Noce thinks about liberalism. I mean, the truth is that the word liberalism can mean, in my book, 5 or 6 different things. So one has to be careful. There is a level in which liberalism means anti-totalitarianism. You could say that a liberal is somebody who refuses totalitarianism, that refuses the domain of politics over every aspect of life. Then, by definition, any Christian or Catholic should be liberal, right? I mean, it is absolutely obvious. On the other hand, there is a form of liberalism which is what you call like Adam Smith, right? Like economic laissez-faire, right? Economic libertarianism. The Noce was not really in favor of that. He thought that economic libertarianism, at least, is pushed beyond the way, like Leo XIII and John Paul II, they will tell you that economic freedom is important. So, but it could become ideological too, right? You could have a vision in which there is the invisible hand that moves everything, and you don't touch it, right? History is marching towards economic fulfillment by its own way. You see that there is a totalitarian danger there too. I mean, it's a different kind of direction of history. It's a direction of history in which the market is sales, right? I mean, that's also a question. Then there is liberalism in the American sense of liberal, in the American sense, right? Which is a kind of progressivism. Herbert Crowley, the New Republic, they call themselves liberal too, and it's really more rooted in the theological distinction within Protestantism, between liberal Protestantism and fundamental. So that's third tree. Okay, then there is the romantic liberalism, European romantic liberalism, like Benjamin Constant all the way to Benedetto Croce. That's also called liberalism. You see, they're all completely different things, right? And still people talk about liberalism. Okay, so you need to do some distinction. But in some of these senses, Del Noce was very open to liberalism. Certainly the anti-totalitarian sense, the sense of reasonable economic freedom, in the sense that in the battle against totalitarianism, inevitably the person that you find as your natural allies are secular people who are not totalitarian. And secular people who are not totalitarian, typically they will call themselves liberal. Right? So in that sense, he would think that those are the people one should talk to. Except those are sometimes not the people who call themselves liberal in this country, for example. Yeah, no problem. So it's a big mess, terminologically speaking. But that answered the question at all. Yes.
So, are you telling us it's time to head to the mountains, or are you saying there's still hope? Because you were saying that human nature is a reality, and there's the desire for the love of beauty, the desire to know, still exists. So that's hopeful.
No, I don't think we should run to mountains.
Okay, well, because my father many times was talking about, it might be time to head to Malta. Can't do it. Not practical. Well, one practical thought I had, I think we should spend a lot of time on thinking about the really practical things we can do on a daily basis. And of course, I'm in education, and so there's a lot of good that can be done just in terms of modeling a certain disposition to reality, and addressing mainstream sort of default positions that have sort of agenda embedded in them. But one thought I had is there's a vernacular of contemporary agenda. Is how
What do you mean by that?
Okay, vernacular. So in terms like mental health, even, I'm not saying there's not some reality there, but we're starting to frame things that actually have a lot of other dimensions to them as mental health. There's a vernacular there that's
Like
implying
a reductionism.
Yeah. So there's an idealistic use of language there. There's an instrumentalization of language there. So I think one tactic on a day-to-day basis is recognizing these terms that are being brought in and rejecting them and not using them in our our day-to-day interactions with people. So I don't know. That was just one thought about a practical step. I mean, we have to have some kind of hope that there is discourse that's possible, right? About what's true and about the end of the person, the goal. So I don't know. What do you think about that idea and other practical ideas?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the Noce does not have much to say about that. I mean, I can tell you my experience is that again, you can find this kind of ferocious ideologue out there, and if one is in an institutional position, they should be resisted. Obviously, there is no question. But for most of us, most of the people I meet don't fall into that category. There are people who are maybe swayed by ideology, or they're swayed by this trends, but they are open to being treated like human beings. I don't know, that's a little banal, but I mean, essentially, again, it's a matter of breaking through the abstraction of these ideological schemes and trying to reawaken in our day-by-day interactions. They are more genuine, more simple human desires, because at the end of the day, we are presuming that they are the same. That sounds very general, but I think it's a good guide for practical interactions with people.
Yeah, and I think there does have to be a kind of daily conversion to that hope, because I think there is the danger of despair that you can, despair that universal human nature exists. I think you mentioned that.
Yes, he was raising the same question, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, and also it's very important to have a supportive community that confirms you in that and that reminds you of that. But I think there is a bit, as I said, the direction of history is really tends to. It's like a boogaboo, tends to scare. Oh, the direction history is going that way, and the bombardment of excessive social media and excessive news is counterproductive, right? So in some sense, you don't want to pay too much attention to these things. I mean, I read, people, there is the latest outrage on, I don't know what issue, one of these issues, I'm not going even to name it, and then everybody gets on it. Maybe we shouldn't pay attention sometimes. I mean, sometimes we just don't want to, because the reality of most people we meet is not described by what you see on Twitter. And we sometimes let Twitter replace the reality of the people next door. Finally, I think that taking a step back from this big picture, because I mean, generally speaking, we don't understand where history is going. And the idea that we can understand that history is going down the drain is also an unwarranted abstraction that we are not able to formulate. We are not able to say that. The statement that history is going down the drain is an irrational statement, but the honest thing is that we don't know. I mean, and see what I'm saying? And the reason so we are affected by these great abstract narratives, also in the negative sense. I mean, the Noce was making a big deal, in fact, about the fact that you can believe in modernity negatively, right? There are some people that no more, not many anymore. There used to be lots of people who believe that modernity was this march of progress towards ever-increasing happiness. And then there were the people who believed that modernity is ever-increasing misery and falling apart. These large-scale narratives are not helpful either way, right? So we don't want to believe in modernity neither as a god nor as a devil, right? I mean, that's the problem. Where we are today, Austin, maybe 5 years ago, will be a disaster, but not because there is a universal theory of history that says that it must go to hell. It may, okay? That's it. Yes.
So speaking of progress, I'm curious to know more about what Del Noce thought about the relationship between totalitarianism and technology. You mentioned at the beginning that there's this simple view that it's just like Genghis Khan modern technology. Do you think that in his view there was some necessary connection between the two? Could you have a society that believed in technological progress that didn't become more totalitarian over time?
Well, it depends what you mean by belief. I mean, the Noce was nuanced. He thought that in some sense, technology came out of Christendom. I mean, historically, it's hard to argue against that. That technology, in some sense, expressed the desire that nobody be a slave. All right, expressed the desire that the call of Genesis to whatever. What does Genesis say? To steward, to dominate the world. The question is that to him, so it's not an intrinsic. This is a discussion I always have with, there is a guy in Washington, Michael Henry, he's a nice scholar, a good friend of mine, always have this discussion. He's totally on the side that technology is intrinsically violent, right? The Noce didn't go that far. I mean, he believed that technology as such is a dimension of human life, which is inevitable. And so the problem is when you put a ism at the end, an ISM, right? When that particular dimension becomes an absolute and becomes the source of your hope and where the salvation of the world is coming from. Recently, there was this new techno-optimist manifesto. Did you see that? That was kind of interesting because for a change, somebody made a philosophical statement. Maybe maybe it's a silly psychological, it's a philosophical statement, but at least they tried to think, and it was an affirmation that that technology is what will save. All right, Del Noce would certainly disagree with that. So it would fall somewhere in between. Sorry, did I answer your question?
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I'm wondering, so I just finished reading the book Nine at the Republic with my students, and we studied the way that democratic regime turns into a tyranny. And in some ways it seems similar to Del Noce's critique of liberalism that when like desires, like what's desires come forward, and there's a way for tyranny to kind of come in. And I was just wondering, what does he think of democracy? Did he have any particular form of government?
That's another thing where it's very nuanced. I mean, the good thing about the Noce is that he was not willing to fall for simplified schemes, but he would sometimes he would really try to look at three different sides of the question, and which is a good thing to do, but would not commit. So, first of all, I agree with you that there are some uncanny resemblances in which the four stages in the Republic, they seem to be really to capture a historical law. But again, Del Noce would think that some of that really changed after Christianity. Meaning that before Christianity, democracy was at best one of four possible unstable and potentially corrupt form of government, which was going to give way to other forms. I think, if I understand correctly, that he believes that after Christianity, he gives some hints. Really, democracy also takes a personalistic aspect. In some sense, it's the recognition that every human being has the same value, right? Which is probably not easy to find among the Greeks. I'm no expert, right? And so he seems to say that there is an ideal aspect to democracy that comes from Christianity, which is this recognition that everybody has the same value as a part of the social organism, and not intrinsic inequalities, so to speak. Of course, this is a very abstract, very general comment that has nothing to do without elections or methods of finding governments, but that was his justification. He was a Christian Democrat in the European sense. And another thing he says about democracy, which I think is interesting, he says that without Christianity, democracy is doomed to become a dictatorship of groups. I don't remember the language he uses, but he says that without democracy, ultimately, if 51% oppress 49%, thanks a lot for democracy. You know what I mean? If it is just a matter of numbers, who gets more votes, that has no ideal moral content, and so as such, it would be worthless. You see what I'm saying? So he says that democracy cannot be that. Democracy cannot just be the power of numbers, because otherwise it would just be as questionable as any other form of power. And so what's left, I think, is that idea I mentioned before, that Christianity can bring an element of personalism into democracy. That's what I remember. Yes.
If I may, there's one more maybe after this, you can take one more. What I wanted to ask is, I often say that the Noce was somehow prophetic, and there's this article that he wrote, I think it was one of the very last he wrote, about how Marxism was defeating the East because it won in the West. And I was wondering, did he understand that this was the course of things very early on, right after the Second World War? Was there a growth in his thought, like, did he make a mistake, let's say, or can we phrase him also for having been very clear on things?
The Noce was not an oracle, but he was very dedicated to try to understand society and history. I think that what people view as his very prophetic texts are really starting in the late 60s. Because in the late 60s, you could see certain ideas taking hold, establishing themselves, that later then developed up to us. And I don't think that, in fact, we had many more. We don't have a lot of ideas that people did not have in 1969. They may be more extreme. We have reached crazy consequences, but the fundamental philosophical options established themselves at that time. And the reason that the book was in many ways prophetic is because he thought through the late 60s. In my book, and the early 70s. I remember another reason that I decided to do this translation, because I'm not a philosopher, I'm a mathematician, but I thought that it was an injustice that Noce was kind of prisoner of his own language. I was back visiting my parents back in Italy, and my dad had one of his books in the library, and I was looking, I always say the same story, probably you heard it before, that there's this passage from 1970. 1970 said, okay, so William Reich said this, you say that, then there is nothing to be surprised about the idea of homosexual marriage. And I thought that for 1970, that was pretty good, it was very predictive. But it was there. It was clearly there. You just had to read Wilhelm Reich and take him seriously, which many people didn't, right? You had just to read Marcuse and take him seriously. You had to, so the Noce was not a wizard. It was just a systematic thinker that he looked at these authors and they saw that you could draw a straight line and see where it went, right? So I would say that really we still live in many ways in the world that took shape after World War II, the late 50s and 60s, in response to fascist, Nazi, and so on, and this kind of Western synthesis. This is still our world, right? And then it became clear later. The consequences became clear later. And the article that you mentioned, it's interesting because he wrote it a week before he died. And I don't think he wrote the title. The title is very dramatic. As you said, that Marxists died in the East because he triumphed in the West. Okay, that's I don't know if he wrote the title, but the point is that, as I said before, the West defeated Marxists by partially appropriating some of its philosophical assumptions, not its economic, but some of its philosophical assumptions, and combined them with more liberal assumptions. Right? So there was a new synthesis, and this new synthesis, we are still living with it. And again, it took place 60 years ago or something like that. That's my interpretation.
And the last one?
Yeah, my question is, do you see hope in universities for, let's say, the rediscovery of the Logos?
If I see universities rediscovering the Logos, I don't know. Not much, no. Well, what can I say to that? I mean, I would say a couple of things. One is that, even if people criticize science and technology, and we have our problems, it is true that a lot of people in science and technology still believe that there's some concept of truth. So that's a plus.
I guess I meant specifically the philosophy departments.
Philosophy departments, I'm the wrong person to ask. I don't work there. The problem with my only uninformed impression is that the tradition in English-speaking world has been shaped very much by the analytic tradition, which is kind of a more pseudo, very logical, scientific, with a lot of emphasis on language. So that's probably not going to change.
I mean, there's certainly a Logos in science and math.
Say that again.
In the science and math departments, I think there's a.
But no, I don't expect miracles there either. But if you look at this contraposition between recognizing that there is some universal truth and that there is a value in contemplation of the truth for the sake of contemplation, not just for exploitation. Paradoxically, even if technology is accused of being exploitative, in some branches, the more theoretical, the more abstract branches, people do believe in the truth, and so that's a plus. I mean, and they get annoyed when politicization, ideological thinking tries to encroach on their discipline, but they are not going to change the world. I'm just saying that those are probably going to survive. What happens in the philosophy department, I don't know.
Before we all go, just want to thank you very much again for, maybe there is some hope in the universities if they still host talks like this and there are people coming and there are people that are watching and will watch it. For those that don't know, once again, I gave a little introduction earlier. Our website, austin-institute.org. There is one event that will not appear, but we have the speaker here. She's going to talk tomorrow, Dr. Hall. She's going to talk tomorrow about modernity and its challenges to some of the undergraduate students. Harlan, sorry, Dr. Hall Harlan, right? Yeah, no. They're married, so I should remember. We have events for the graduate students, a dinner coming up November 29th for graduate students, professionals, younger and older ones. I'm not going to look at anyone. We have reading groups. We read the Noce. We are reading Mary Arrington. We will be reading Arthur Brooks. I think it's going to be next. So just go on the website, register. There's an opportunity for all to grow. The academic women group is also starting for graduate and postgraduate. So anyway, it's about the Austin Institute. Thank you again.
Thank you for coming.